Hello, Quincy. My name's Eileen Fontenot. I'm one of the Thomas Crane librarians, and I'm here today with Del Case. Welcome. He'll be giving us a guided listening tour of the great album by the Beatles, Abbey Road, starting at 7 o'clock, Tuesday, November 19th at the main library. Glad to have you.
Happy to be here.
Good. So before we talk about the program that night, can you tell me a little bit about yourself and your musical background?
Sure. I've been living in Quincy for 15 years. I originally was teaching at Eastern Nazarene College, where I directed a community choir and taught a bunch of different kinds of courses. And then for the last 10 years, I've been teaching at Wheaton College down in Norton.
Oh, okay.
But I still live here in Quincy. And I often do talks at the library on music appreciation. I've talked about classical music, but I've also talked about popular music, which is an area of interest of mine. And I'm really excited to continue this sort of a la carte series on the Beatles. A couple of years ago, I did a talk about the White Album, and it's now the 50th anniversary of Abbey Road, which was one of the Beatles' last albums. And so I'll be spending an hour or so on that evening talking about the record.
Okay. So can you tell me a bit more about what people can expect in the program? Are you going to play the whole album and talk in between songs, things like that?
Well, that's an interesting question because if you know the album well, the first side of the album is a bunch of different, distinct, discrete songs. So I suppose I could.
Right.
But the famous thing about the album is that the second side is actually essentially one long song, almost like a medley with no interruptions. It had never been done before in popular music. So it would actually, the interesting thing about the record is really the second side. So there's no real way to stop in the middle. So I'm not going to play all the way through and talk, but I'm going to play snippets and songs and stop and talk about things to listen for. The goal is basically to help people take an album that they might already know and love and learn how to appreciate it in even a deeper way. Then again, if you've always heard of the album or you've heard of the Beatles and you haven't actually listened to them before, it'll be sort of an introduction to what makes them great.
Right. Yeah, I'm wondering if you'll be getting some people who've never really experienced the Beatles that well, since it's such an somewhat older album.
Yeah, then again, the Beatles are still relevant. You know, they're
Yeah.
very, very influential on pop artists today. And of course, there's that movie Yesterday that just came out
that's right.
last year, maybe, about a guy who wakes up in a world in which the Beatles had never existed. So those songs are still a part of our sort of cultural memory. But what's important about, I think, this is that the Abbey Road as an album, especially the second half, was really conceived of as almost like a symphony, like a 20 or 25 minute composition. That is the second side of it. And much like in a symphony, there are ways to listen to a longer piece of music that are different than the ways you bring toward the ways that you try to listen to maybe a 3 or 4 minute song.
Right.
So it's an interesting way that I think actually that if you come to this talk, you might actually come away with some listening skills that might help you even appreciate other kinds of music. For example, like a symphony that you have to sort of have a little bit more patience to really appreciate.
Oh, wow. Yeah, I never considered that. And so I know it's the 50th anniversary of the album, but why this particular Beatles album that is so important, like, for you? And for
Well, it's one of my favorites. You know, probably the Beatles' most popular song is on that record. It's "Here Comes the Sun." If you look at, you know, the Spotify playlist for the Beatles, that's got the most listens. It's many people's favorite Beatles song, and so that's certainly a reason enough to talk about that record. But it's just chock full of so many great songs, as are all the Beatles records. And any Beatles record is worth really a deep dive into. This is really one of the great albums. It's, you know, Beatles fans, among Beatles fans, they will say that there are 3 albums that are the best. They are Revolver is usually number 1. Abbey Road is right up there, and then you get down to some of the more famous ones like Sgt. Pepper's, which is a great album, but many people consider Abbey Road and Revolver to be the two best of the Beatles albums, and so let's do it.
Yeah. Are you going to go through like some of the history of the time too, or is it just basically just focused on the music?
Probably more like the music. You know, so Sgt. Pepper's, which is a heavily psychedelically infused record, that really reflects sort of the time period more. The Beatles sort of got that out of their system, and by the time they released the White Album, then Abbey Road, they were really trying to explore music from the inside rather than explore their consciousness and then try to put the drug experience into the music.
Right.
So we can actually get away with focusing a little more in detail on the music than maybe the culture for this record.
What sort of like research have you done besides listening to it over and over? Do you read other articles about the album and things like that?
I mean, there are many great books about the Beatles and of course scholarly articles. There are lots of professors that do research on the Beatles in highly technical ways. I've read a lot of that stuff, but I've also just spent a lot of time teaching about this record and lots of other Beatles records to a general audience, whether it's people here at the library or undergraduates at various different colleges. So you don't really need any background as a listener to come to this. And as a trained musician, I can hear the record in ways that are sort of more detailed. So the nice thing about this kind of event is that I might bring a degree of a degree of knowledge and expertise, but I don't know everything there is to know about the Beatles. And in fact, one of the great things about popular music is that people have their own engagement with the songs.
Right.
And when they say, I remember listening to this record when I was 15 years old, here, that's very important and relevant. And so what I like to do is I like to start off the conversation by telling what I think is interesting, but I love to open up the talk to anybody in the audience to add their thoughts.
Oh, that's great.
Because they have a lot to add. And I'm looking forward to hearing what people have to say.
Especially people who were actually, teenagers and young people at the time. It was a crazy time, I'm sure.
Absolutely, yeah.
Well, thank you for joining us. Do you have anything else to add about what we might expect?
I just hope people comment. This is really appropriate for anybody, all ages, really. I mean, I've certainly had older kids come and teenagers.
Oh, okay.
If there's anybody in your life who likes the Beatles, bring them because it's going to be accessible to everybody.
Well, that sounds great. So, everyone's welcome, as Del said, to come to the main library here in Quincy Center to come together at 7 o'clock, Tuesday, November 19th, for this guided listening experience of Abbey Road. Hope to see you there.